The $500 fine notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, wedged between a credit card offer and a grocery store circular, and I stood in my driveway in Phoenix, Arizona, staring at it like it might suddenly make sense if I just squinted hard enough. I'm Jason Vickers, and I'd lived in Sunset Meadows, this planned community on the outskirts of Phoenix, for exactly 3 years without a single problem. The neighborhood was nice enough, tree-lined streets despite the desert climate, houses that all looked vaguely similar but not quite identical, and neighbors who waved but mostly kept to themselves. Perfect for someone like me who worked from home as a software developer and valued peace and quiet. The letter was from the Homeowners Association, signed by someone named Barbara Hendricks, president of the HOA board. It stated, in unnecessarily formal language, that my wind chimes constituted a noise violation under Section 7.3.2 of the Community Guidelines, and that I had 72 hours to remove them or face additional fines of $100 per day. I looked up at my front porch. The wind chimes in question were a simple set I'd bought at a craft fair in Scottsdale 6 months ago. Bamboo tubes that made gentle, pleasant sounds when the desert breeze caught them. They weren't loud. They weren't obnoxious. They were exactly the kind of thing thousands of people had hanging on their porches across America. My phone was already in my hand before I consciously decided to call. The HOA office number was printed at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered on the third ring. Sunset Meadows HOA, this is Deborah speaking. Hi, I'm Jason Vickers, 2847 Desert Rose Drive. I just received a notice about wind chimes. One moment, please. There was typing, then a pause. Yes, Mr. Vickers. A complaint was filed about noise disturbance from your property. The board reviewed it and issued the violation notice. Who complained? I asked. I'm not at liberty to disclose that information. Okay, but these wind chimes are barely audible. They're not some massive metal set. They're bamboo, and they only make sound when there's a breeze. The community guidelines are very clear about noise disturbances, Mr. Vickers. If you'd like to appeal, you can submit a written request to appear before the board at their next meeting. When's that? 3 weeks from Thursday. And in the meantime, I'm supposed to just pay $500. You have 72 hours to remove the offending item. If you do so, the fine will be waived. I thanked her, mostly out of habit, and hung up. Standing there in the Arizona heat, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize someone's trying to push you around for no good reason, and you have to decide whether you're going to just take it or push back. I went inside, poured myself some iced tea, and sat down at my computer. The Sunset Meadows Community Guidelines were available online, all 73 pages of them. I'd skimmed them when I bought the house, but hadn't paid much attention since. Now, I read Section 7.3.2 carefully. Residents shall not create or permit noise disturbances that unreasonably interfere with other residents' peaceful enjoyment of their property. This includes but is not limited to loud music, machinery operation outside designated hours, and decorative items that create persistent noise. The language was vague enough to be weaponized, which I suspected was the point. What counted as unreasonable? What was persistent? My wind chimes sounded maybe 10% of the time, and only when there was wind. That hardly seemed persistent. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching HOA laws in Arizona. What I found was both enlightening and depressing. HOAs had broad authority to enforce their rules, but they also had to follow certain procedures. They couldn't be arbitrary or discriminatory. They had to give residents due process. By evening, I decided on a course of action. I wasn't taking down my wind chimes, and I wasn't paying the fine. Instead, I drafted a formal appeal letter citing the vagueness of the rule and requesting specific evidence of how my wind chimes constituted an unreasonable noise disturbance. I also requested the identity of the complainant, the specific dates and times of the alleged disturbances, and any objective measurements of sound levels. I sent it via certified mail the next morning. 3 days later, another letter arrived. The fine was upheld, and I now had an additional $300 penalty for failure to comply with a board order. Still no specifics about who complained or any actual evidence. Just more threats. That's when I decided to get creative. On Saturday morning, I walked down to my neighbor's house. Tom Richardson lived 2 doors down with his wife and teenage daughter. He was a high school teacher, friendly enough that we'd had a few driveway conversations about sports and the weather. He was washing his car when I approached. "Hey Jason, what's up? Got a question for you. Do you ever hear my wind chimes?" He paused, sponge dripping soapy water. "Your what, wind chimes?" "On my front porch." "Oh yeah, I think I've noticed them. Can't say I've ever actually heard them though." "Why?" I showed him the letters. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as he read. "This is insane," he said. $500 for wind chimes. I've lived here 8 years and never heard of anything like this. Have you had any issues with the HOA? Nothing major. They sent me a notice once about my trash cans being visible from the street, but that was it. He handed back the letters. "What are you going to do? Fight it. But I wanted to ask you something first. Would you be willing to sign a statement saying you've never been disturbed by my wind chimes?" "Sure, absolutely." Over the next week, I knocked on every door within earshot of my house. Out of 23 neighbors I spoke with, 21 had never even noticed my wind chimes, and the other 2 had noticed them but found them pleasant. All 23 signed statements for me. I compiled these into a document and submitted it to the HOA along with another appeal letter and a request for a hearing. This time I got a response within 48 hours, and it wasn't what I expected. The letter, again signed by Barbara Hendricks, stated that my appeals were denied and that the fine had now escalated to $1,200 due to continued non-compliance. Furthermore, if I didn't remove the wind chimes immediately, the HOA would place a lien on my property. A lien on my house for wind chimes. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Patricia Gomez, and she specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Phoenix, and she agreed to meet with me the next day. Patricia was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to my story, reviewed all the letters and statements, and then leaned back in her chair. "This is harassment," she said flatly. "The board is clearly targeting you, and I'd bet money there's a personal reason behind it. I barely know anyone on the board. I've never even been to a meeting. Have you had any conflicts with neighbors, any disputes, even minor ones?" I thought about it. "No, nothing I can think of." Well, something triggered this. Barbara Hendricks doesn't strike me as someone who randomly decides to destroy a homeowner over wind chimes. There's usually a reason with people like her. She tapped her pen on the desk. "Here's what I recommend. First, don't remove the wind chimes. Second, send the board a letter demanding a hearing under Arizona's HOA statutes. They're required to give you one. Third, start documenting everything. Every interaction, every letter, everything." Will they really put a lien on my house? They can, but it's risky for them. If we can show they're acting arbitrarily or in bad faith, a judge will throw it out and might even sanction them. But yes, technically they have that power. I left her office feeling both better and worse. Better because I had professional help. Worse, because I now realized how serious this had become. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening at the community center. In the meantime, I did some digging into Barbara Hendricks. It didn't take long to find information. She lived in Sunset Meadows on Cactus Ridge Court, about half a mile from my house. She'd been HOA president for 6 years, according to the community website, and before that had served as vice president for 2 years. I also found her Facebook page, which was mostly public. Lots of posts about community standards, property values, and maintaining neighborhood character. There were also several posts complaining about various neighbors, though no names were mentioned. Barbara, it seemed, took her role very seriously. Too seriously, perhaps. On the day of the hearing, Patricia met me at the community center at 6:30. The meeting was scheduled for 7. The building was a squat, tan structure with a small parking lot and a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. When we walked in, I was surprised to see at least 30 residents already there. Word had apparently spread about the hearing. I recognized several of the neighbors I'd spoken with, including Tom Richardson, who gave me a supportive nod. The HOA board sat at a table at the front of the room. 5 people total. Barbara Hendricks sat in the middle, a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair cut in a severe bob and glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked exactly like her Facebook photos, which meant she looked exactly like someone who would fine you for wind chimes. To her right was a man who appeared to be in his 60s, heavyset with gray hair. To her left, a younger woman, maybe 30s, who kept glancing nervously at the crowd. The other 2 board members were older, a man and a woman who both looked retired. Barbara called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. We have several items on tonight's agenda. First up is the appeal hearing for Mr. Jason Vickers regarding a noise violation. I stood, and Patricia stood with me. We walked to the front, and I was directed to sit in a single chair facing the board. Patricia stood beside me. "Mr. Vickers," Barbara said, her tone already disapproving, "you're here to appeal the board's decision regarding wind chimes on your property. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this board takes its responsibility to maintain community standards very seriously. We have rules for a reason, and those rules apply to everyone equally." "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks," Patricia said smoothly. "We appreciate the board's time. As you know, my client believes the fine issued against him is both excessive and unsupported by evidence. We've submitted extensive documentation showing that his wind chimes have not disturbed any neighbors. In fact, we have signed statements from 23 residents stating that they've either never heard the wind chimes or found them pleasant. The board has reviewed those statements," Barbara said dismissively. "However, we received a specific complaint from a resident who was being disturbed. That complaint is valid and the violation stands." "May we know who filed the complaint?" Patricia asked. "Complaints can be filed anonymously." "Actually, Mrs. Hendricks, under Arizona HOA statute, residents have the right to face their accusers in matters involving fines and enforcement actions. If you're basing this fine on a complaint, Mr. Vickers has the right to know who made it and to challenge its validity." Barbara's face tightened. "The board has discretion in these matters. With respect, you don't, not according to state law." Patricia pulled out a document. "Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33-1803. Would you like me to read it aloud?" There was a long pause. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the older woman to Barbara's right spoke up. "Perhaps we should consult with our attorney before proceeding." "We don't need to consult anyone," Barbara snapped. "Fine. The complaint came from Mrs. Christine Ferris, who lives at 2851 Desert Rose Drive. my next-door neighbor. I turned in my seat and spotted Christine sitting in the back row. She was maybe 50, divorced as far as I knew, and we'd barely spoken in the 3 years I'd lived there. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mrs. Ferris," Patricia said, "would you mind explaining what disturbance my client's wind chimes have caused you?" Christine stood reluctantly. "They're just constant noise. All day, all night. I can't sleep. I can't relax in my own home. Have you ever spoken to Mr. Vickers about this?" "No, I went straight to the board." "And when did this disturbance begin?" "About 7 months ago when he put them up." I stood, unable to help myself. "I bought them 6 months ago, and I've never seen you outside, Christine. You've never said a word to me about any problem." "Sit down, Mr. Vickers," Barbara ordered. "No," I said, my frustration finally boiling over. "This is ridiculous. If Christine had a problem, she could have knocked on my door. We're neighbors. Instead, she files an anonymous complaint, and the HOA fines me $500 without any investigation, any evidence, any due process. You're in violation of community guidelines," Barbara said coldly. "The fine stands, and if you don't remove those wind chimes by end of business tomorrow, we'll proceed with the lien." Patricia stepped forward. "Mrs. Hendricks, I need to be very clear about something. If you proceed with this lien, we will file suit against the HOA for harassment, abuse of authority, and violations of state law. We have extensive documentation that my client's wind chimes are not a genuine disturbance. We have statements from nearly 24 neighbors. We have measurements showing the sound level is well below any reasonable threshold for noise complaints, and we have evidence that you failed to follow proper procedures in investigating and adjudicating this complaint. Are you threatening this board? I'm informing you of the legal consequences of your actions." Barbara stood abruptly. "This hearing is over. The board will take your comments under advisement and will issue our final decision within 5 business days. This meeting is adjourned." She gathered her papers and left through a side door. The other board members followed, looking uncomfortable. The crowd erupted in conversation. Tom Richardson came up to me immediately. "Jason, that was insane. They didn't even listen to anything you said." "Welcome to HOA board meetings," another neighbor said, a woman I recognized but didn't know well. "Barbara runs this place like her personal fiefdom." Over the next 20 minutes, I had at least a dozen conversations with neighbors who were outraged on my behalf. Several shared their own stories of HOA overreach, from fines over mailbox colors to threats over basketball hoops. A picture was emerging, and it wasn't pretty. Patricia and I left around 8:30. In the parking lot, she turned to me. "That went about as badly as it could have. So what now?" "Now we wait for their decision and then we sue. I'll start drafting the complaint tonight. We'll file in Maricopa County Superior Court probably early next week. This is really going to court over wind chimes. Unless Barbara backs down, yes. But Jason, I need you to understand something. This isn't really about wind chimes. This is about power and control. Barbara Hendricks sees you as a threat because you stood up to her. If we don't push back, she'll make your life hell until you either comply or move." I drove home feeling exhausted and angry. My house, which had felt like a sanctuary 3 months ago, now felt like a battleground. The next morning, I woke up to find Christine Ferris standing on my front porch. Through the window, I could see her looking uncomfortable. I opened the door. "Jason, I need to talk to you." "Okay." She glanced around nervously. "Can I come in?" I let her inside, offered coffee, which she declined, and we sat in my living room. "I need to apologize," she said. "I didn't want any of this to happen. Barbara came to me about 2 months ago and asked if your wind chimes bothered me. I said they were a little annoying sometimes, mostly just being polite, you know? I didn't think anything of it. Then last month she told me she was filing a complaint on my behalf and asked me to sign a statement. I should have said no. I should have talked to you first. I'm sorry. So you're not actually bothered by them? Not really, no. I mean, sometimes I hear them, but it's not a big deal. Barbara made it sound like she was doing me a favor, cleaning up the neighborhood or whatever. Christine looked miserable. Last night after the meeting, she called me and yelled at me for not being more forceful. She said I made her look bad. Why is she doing this? Honestly, I think she's angry because you didn't come to her when you moved in. She likes it when new residents introduce themselves to the board, kiss the ring kind of thing. When you didn't, she took it personally. Then when she saw your win chimes, she saw an opportunity. I sat back processing this. That's the pettiest thing I've ever heard. You're not wrong. Look, I'll write a letter to the board withdrawing my complaint. I'll say I overreacted and that your win chimes don't actually bother me. Maybe that'll help. I appreciate it, Christine. Really. She left a few minutes later, and I immediately called Patricia to tell her about the conversation. She was pleased but cautious. It helps, but don't expect Barbara to back down just because her original complaint fell apart. In fact, she might get more aggressive to save face. Patricia was right. The board's decision arrived via certified mail on Monday. Not only was the fine upheld, it had been increased to $2,000 for what they called continued defiance of board authority. The letter stated that a lien would be filed against my property within 10 days, unless I paid in full and removed the wind chimes. Patricia filed our lawsuit that afternoon. We sued the HOA, the board collectively, and Barbara Hendricks individually for harassment, abuse of authority, violation of Arizona HOA statutes, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We asked for damages, attorney fees, and an injunction preventing any further enforcement actions. The local news picked up the story within days. I got a call from a reporter at the Arizona Republic asking for an interview. I agreed, figuring publicity couldn't hurt. The article ran on Thursday with the headline, "Phoenix Man Sues HOA Over Wind Chime Fine." It was sympathetic to my position and quoted several neighbors supporting me. That's when things got interesting. On Friday evening, I was sitting on my front porch, enjoying the sunset and the gentle sound of my wind chimes, when Tom Richardson walked up my driveway carrying something. "Hey Jason, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" He held up a package. "I bought wind chimes. Beautiful copper ones from this place in Temp. I'm going to hang them on my porch tonight." I stared at him. "Tom, you don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to. Barbara and her board need to learn they can't just bully people. Besides, I actually like wind chimes. My grandmother had them when I was a kid. If they find me too, well, I guess we'll have matching lawsuits." "Your wife is okay with this." It was her idea. Over the weekend, something remarkable happened. 6 more houses on my street put up wind chimes. Then it spread. By Tuesday, I counted 15 houses within 3 blocks that had wind chimes. Some were subtle bamboo sets like mine. Others were elaborate metal arrangements that you could probably hear from space. The neighborhood had declared war on the HOA, and wind chimes were our weapon of choice. Barbara responded exactly as you'd expect. Violation notices went out to every single house with wind chimes. 47 notices in total, each demanding immediate removal and carrying a $500 fine. That's when I had my idea. On Wednesday evening, I created a Facebook group called Sunset Meadows Wind Chime Club. The description read, "A community organization dedicated to celebrating wind chimes and supporting neighbors' rights to reasonable decorative choices. All residents welcome. I invited everyone I knew in the neighborhood. By Thursday morning, the group had 83 members. By Friday, it had broken 200. We organized our first official meeting for the following Saturday at the community center. I wasn't sure what to expect in terms of turnout, but when I arrived at the center at 9 in the morning, there were already 50 people waiting outside. By 9:30, when we officially started, we had over 100 residents packed into the meeting room. The same room where the HOA board had tried to intimidate me just 3 weeks earlier. I stood at the front, feeling nervous but determined. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Jason Vickers, and I guess I'm accidentally the founder of this Wind Chime Club. For those who don't know the backstory, here's what happened. I gave them the full story, from the first fine to the lawsuit to Barbara's vendetta. People listened intently, and when I finished, several hands shot up. A man in his 30s spoke first. I'm Robert Chen. I live on Sagaro Way. I got one of these notices too, and I'm not taking my wind chimes down. What's the HOA going to do? Fine all of us? Probably, I said. But that's kind of the point. If they try to fine everyone, it shows how ridiculous this rule is. It also shows that they're being arbitrary and vindictive. Can they really put liens on all our properties? Someone else asked. Patricia, who I'd invited to attend, stood up. Technically, yes, but practically no. If they tried to file liens against dozens of properties over wind chimes, it would be blatantly abusive. Any judge would see through it immediately. Plus, every lien they file is a potential lawsuit, and legal fees add up quickly. Most HOAs are insured, but insurance companies won't cover clearly malicious actions. A woman in the back raised her hand. I'm Margaret Torres. I've lived in Sunset Meadows for 12 years, and I'm on the Architectural Review Committee. I want you all to know that not everyone on the board or the committees supports what Barbara is doing. Several of us have tried to talk sense into her, but she's immovable. She sees this as a test of her authority. Can't the other board members remove her? Tom asked. We can call for a vote of no confidence, but it requires a majority of the full board, and Barbara has 2 loyalists who always vote with her. The math doesn't work. What about the homeowners? I asked. Can we vote out the board? Margaret nodded. Yes, but it requires a special election, and you need 20% of homeowners to sign a petition calling for one. That's about 140 households. We have 200 people in our Facebook group as of this morning, I said. Can you help us organize a petition? Absolutely. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, we had formed committees for petition gathering, legal support coordination, and media relations. We also decided to make our wind chime display bigger and more visible. If Barbara wanted a war over wind chimes, we'd give her one she couldn't ignore. Someone suggested we coordinate a neighborhood-wide wind chime installation on the same day. Make it an event, invite the media, really lean into it. The idea caught fire immediately. We set the date for 2 weeks out on a Saturday. The Great Wind Chime Installation Day, someone dubbed it. I created a Facebook event, and within 48 hours, 300 people had responded as interested or going. The Arizona Republic called me for a follow-up interview. The story had resonated with people far beyond Sunset Meadows, apparently. Everyone had their own HOA horror story, and wind chimes had become a symbol of resistance against petty authority. The reporter asked me what I hoped to accomplish. Honestly, I just want to be able to keep my wind chimes without being harassed. But it's become bigger than that. It's about whether a community is governed by reasonable rules or by one person's arbitrary whims. Barbara Hendricks has forgotten that the HOA is supposed to serve the homeowners, not the other way around. That quote made it into the headline. Barbara's response came 3 days later. An emergency HOA board meeting was called, and they announced a new rule. Effective immediately, all decorative items that produce sound were banned. This included wind chimes, water features, and outdoor speakers. Violations would result in immediate fines starting at $1,000. The rule was clearly unconstitutional under Arizona HOA law. You can't just make up rules on the spot without proper notice and voting procedures. Patricia filed for an immediate injunction, which a judge granted within 24 hours. The new rule was suspended pending a full hearing. Meanwhile, our petition was gathering signatures quickly. We had volunteers going door to door every evening. Within a week, we'd exceeded the required number. We submitted the petition to the board on a Monday morning with 163 signatures calling for a special election. Under Arizona law, the board had 30 days to schedule the election, once a valid petition was submitted. Barbara tried to challenge the petition's validity, claiming some signatures were fraudulent, but her objections were overruled by the management company's attorney, who apparently recognized a losing battle when he saw one. The election was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, installation day arrived. I woke up early that Saturday morning to news vans already parked on my street. Apparently, the story had grown beyond local news. A producer from a national morning show had reached out wanting to do a segment. By 10 in the morning, Desert Rose Drive looked like a wind chime festival. People had gone all out. There were traditional bamboo chimes, elaborate metal ones, handmade ceramic ones, and even some truly bizarre artistic pieces that probably barely qualified as wind chimes but were there in spirit. Tom Richardson had hung a massive 6-foot wind chime made of copper pipes. It caught the breeze and produced deep, resonant tones that you could feel in your chest. "Go big or go home," he told the TV cameras. Over 100 households participated. The neighborhood was filled with gentle ringing, tinkling, and chiming. It was actually beautiful. Sure, in some spots it was maybe a bit much, but the overall effect was peaceful and welcoming. The news cameras loved it. Reporters interviewed dozens of residents, all of whom expressed support for reasonable HOA governance and frustration with Barbara's heavy-handed tactics. One older woman, Mrs. Alina Patterson, gave a particularly memorable interview. "I'm 83 years old, and I've lived in 7 different places with HOAs. Never have I seen someone so determined to make everyone miserable over something so harmless. Barbara Hendricks should be ashamed of herself. These wind chimes are lovely, and this neighborhood is better for having them." The National Morning Show segment aired the following Wednesday. 4.5 minutes about our wind chime rebellion, complete with footage of the installation day and interviews with me, Patricia, and several neighbors. The segment ended with the host saying, "It seems the winds of change are blowing through this Phoenix neighborhood, and they're making beautiful music. Cheesy, maybe, but effective." Our story was now national news. That's when Barbara made her biggest mistake. She scheduled an interview with a local TV station without consulting anyone. The interview aired that evening, and it was a disaster. Barbara, clearly flustered and defensive, claimed that the homeowners were being manipulated by outside agitators and that wind chimes were just the beginning of a decline in community standards. If we allow wind chimes today, what's next? Plastic flamingos, cars on blocks in driveways. There's a slippery slope here, and as HOA president, it's my job to maintain property values. The reporter, bless him, asked the obvious question. "But isn't it true that most of your neighbors actually like the wind chimes and that property values in Sunset Meadows haven't been affected?" That's not the point. The point is rules and order. But you created a new rule specifically to target wind chimes after residents started installing them. Doesn't that seem retaliatory? I don't appreciate your tone. This interview is over. She walked off camera. The footage of her leaving, angry and flustered, became the clip everyone shared online. It was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Memes were made. Barbara Hendricks became, briefly, a symbol of petty authoritarianism across the internet. The fallout was immediate. 3 board members resigned within 48 hours, including Margaret Torres from the Architectural Committee. In their resignation letters, which they posted publicly to the community forum, they stated that they could not in good conscience continue to serve under Barbara's leadership. That left Barbara and one other person, Carl Winters, the heavy-set older man who'd been sitting to her right during my hearing. Under HOA bylaws, they couldn't conduct official business without a quorum, which meant the board was effectively paralyzed. The special election couldn't come fast enough. Patricia's lawsuit was proceeding too. The discovery phase revealed some interesting details. It turned out Barbara had filed 19 different complaints against various residents in the past year alone, far more than any previous HOA president. Several of these complaints were similar to mine, minor issues that seemed to be about asserting control rather than genuine community concerns. We also discovered that Barbara had spent over $20,000 of HOA funds on legal fees related to enforcement actions in just the past 6 months. The HOA's budget was tight, and this spending had depleted the reserve fund significantly. When this information became public, it added fuel to the fire. People weren't just angry about wind chimes anymore. They were angry about wasted money, abused authority, and a board that had forgotten its purpose. The week before the election, we organized a candidate forum. 5 people were running for board positions. The format was simple. Each candidate gave a 5-minute speech, then took questions from residents. I was one of the candidates. I'd resisted at first, not wanting to get that deeply involved. But Tom and several others had convinced me that if we were going to fix things, we needed people willing to serve who understood what had gone wrong. My speech was straightforward. I'm running because I believe HOAs should make our community better, not worse. They should protect our property values through reasonable maintenance standards, not harass residents over harmless decorations. If elected, I'll work to revise our guidelines to be clear, fair, and actually focused on things that matter. And I promise to remember that I work for you, the homeowners, not the other way around. The other reformist candidates gave similar speeches. There was also one candidate who supported Barbara, a man named Harold Peterson, who argued that we needed strong leadership and strict rules. He was booed, which I actually felt bad about. He was entitled to his opinion, even if most people disagreed. Barbara didn't attend the forum, which surprised no one. Election day was a Tuesday. We'd arranged for both in-person voting at the community center and mail-in ballots for those who couldn't attend. Turnout was massive, over 70% of eligible households, which the management company said was unprecedented. The results were announced that evening. All 4 reformist candidates won by wide margins. I got 68% of the vote. Barbara, who had technically been running for re-election, got 11%. She didn't show up to concede or to attend the transition meeting. Carl Winters did attend, mostly to hand over files and access information. He seemed relieved to be done with the whole thing. Our first official board meeting as the new board was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I had one more conversation with Barbara Hendricks. She called me on Saturday evening, 3 days after the election. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "This is Jason." "Mr. Vickers, this is Barbara Hendricks." I know. There was a pause. I wanted to discuss the transition. Carl gave us everything we need. There's nothing to discuss. I also wanted to say that I hope there are no hard feelings. I was only trying to do what I thought was best for the community. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "Mrs. Hendricks, you fined me $500 over wind chimes without any legitimate complaint. You harassed me, threatened my home, and abused your authority. When other residents supported me, you tried to fine all of them too. You spent thousands of dollars of community funds on petty enforcement actions and legal fees, and when people tried to hold you accountable, you doubled down instead of listening. I was enforcing the rules. You were enforcing your personal preferences and calling them rules. There's a difference, and honestly, I think you knew that, which makes it worse." "I see. Well, good luck with the board, Mr. Vickers. You'll find it's not as easy as you think." She hung up. Tom, who was sitting on my couch during this conversation, looked over. "How do you feel?" "Tired, mostly. But good. Ready to fix things." The new board's first meeting was well attended. Over 50 residents showed up to watch us conduct business. Our agenda was ambitious but necessary. First, we voted to dismiss all pending fines related to wind chimes or other decorative sound-producing items. Every fine, every threat, every violation notice was canceled. It was unanimous. Second, we voted to commission a full review of the community guidelines by an independent attorney specializing in HOA law. We wanted rules that were clear, reasonable, and legally sound. No more vague language that could be weaponized. Third, we established new procedures for complaints and enforcement. Any complaint would require the board to investigate and document actual harm before issuing fines. Residents would have the right to face their accusers and to appeal with proper due process. Fourth, we voted to settle my lawsuit against the HOA. The terms were simple. The HOA would pay my attorney fees, issue a formal apology, and make a clear statement that wind chimes and similar decorative items were permitted under the revised guidelines. I dropped all claims against the HOA itself, though I reserved the right to pursue action against Barbara personally. Patricia advised against pursuing Barbara further. "You've won," she said. "She's out of power, discredited, and probably humiliated. Sometimes that's enough." She was right. I let it go. Over the next 3 months. The neighborhood transformed. Not just physically, though the wind chimes did add a certain charm, but culturally. People were more engaged, more willing to communicate, more invested in the community. We held monthly town halls where residents could raise concerns or suggestions. We formed committees for social events, neighborhood beautification, and emergency preparedness. The HOA became what it was supposed to be, a tool for making the community better, not a weapon for controlling it. Property values, contrary to Barbara's predictions, actually increased slightly. Turns out people like living in neighborhoods that feel welcoming and friendly. Christine Ferris apologized to me several more times over the months that followed. I kept telling her it was fine, and eventually she believed me. We weren't close friends, but we were friendly neighbors, which was enough. Tom Richardson and I did become good friends. We had a standing Saturday morning coffee tradition, usually sitting on one of our porches, listening to wind chimes and talking about nothing important. One Saturday, about 6 months after the election, Tom brought up something I'd been wondering about. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd just taken down the wind chimes that first day?" "All the time," I admitted. "I'd have paid the fine, removed them, and that would have been that." And Barbara would still be president, still harassing people, still wasting community funds. Probably. Although someone else would have stood up to her eventually. Maybe, but you did it. And you did it over something as simple and innocent as wind chimes. There's something perfect about that. He was right. The absurdity of the initial conflict had made it clear how unreasonable Barbara's leadership was. If she'd come after me for something more complicated, something genuinely debatable, it might have been harder to rally support. But wind chimes. Everyone understood wind chimes. Everyone could see the overreach. The Arizona Republic did a follow-up story 6 months after our election. The headline was, "Phoenix Neighborhood Finds Harmony After Wind Chime Controversy." It was a nice piece about how communities can self-correct when people get involved. The reporter asked me what I'd learned from the experience. I thought about it for a while before answering. I learned that standing up to bullies matters, even when it seems easier to just give in. I learned that communities are stronger than individual petty tyrants, but only if people are willing to get involved. And I learned that sometimes the smallest things, the things that seem too trivial to fight over, are actually the most important because they reveal character. Barbara's character. The neighborhood's character. My own character. Would you do it again? Absolutely. Though I hope I never have to. The lawsuit settlement included one provision I'd insisted on. The HOA would install a small plaque at the community center. It read, "Sunset Meadows is a community of neighbors, governed by reasonable rules and mutual respect. We believe in open communication, fair processes, and the right of residents to make their homes their own within sensible guidelines." May we never forget that rules serve people, not the other way around. It was unveiled at a community barbecue we organized that fall. Over 200 people attended. There were games for kids, food trucks, and live music, and wind chimes. So many wind chimes, creating a gentle symphony as the desert breeze moved through them. Barbara Hendricks didn't attend, which was fine. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was considering moving. Apparently living in a community where everyone knows you as the woman who lost her mind over wind chimes isn't pleasant. I didn't take any joy in that, but I didn't lose sleep over it either. As the sun set over the Phoenix suburbs that evening, I stood with Tom, Patricia, Margaret, and dozens of neighbors, listening to wind chimes and watching kids play. It was exactly what I'd wanted when I bought the house. Peace, community, and the freedom to make my home feel like home. "You know what the best part is?" Tom said, beer in hand. "What's that? When you moved here, you didn't even care about HOAs or community politics or any of this stuff. You just wanted to hang some wind chimes. Still true. But now look at you. HOA board president, community organizer, defender of decorative freedom." "I prefer reluctant activist for common sense," Margaret laughed. "Whatever you call it, you made a difference. We all did." She was right. We had made a difference, and not just about wind chimes. We'd reminded ourselves and our neighbors that communities belong to the people who live in them, not to whoever happens to hold a title or position. We'd shown that standing up to unreasonable authority, even over something as simple as wind chimes, matters. As the evening wound down and families headed home, I found myself back on my front porch. The original wind chimes that had started everything hung there, bamboo tubes catching the breeze and making their gentle music. I thought about the journey from that first absurd find to this moment. All the stress, the conflict, the work of organizing and running for office and trying to build something better. It had been exhausting and frustrating and often felt ridiculous. But sitting there, listening to wind chimes up and down the street, knowing that my neighbors felt empowered and heard, Knowing that our HOA now worked for us instead of against us, it had been worth it. Sometimes you have to fight the small battles because they're really big battles in disguise. Sometimes wind chimes aren't just wind chimes. They're a line in the sand, a test of whether you're willing to stand up for yourself and your principles when someone tries to push you around. I'd passed that test, and so had my community. The next morning, I woke to an email from a woman in a suburb of Dallas. She'd read about our wind chime rebellion and was facing a similar situation with her own HOA. She wanted advice on how to organize her neighbors. I spent an hour writing her a detailed response, sharing everything we'd learned. Then I realized I should probably make this information more widely available. By afternoon, I'd created a simple website, HOA Accountability Toolkit. It included templates for petitions, guides for organizing community meetings, information about homeowner rights under various state laws, and links to attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. Within a week, the site had 10,000 visitors. Within a month, 50,000. Apparently, there were a lot of people out there dealing with their own versions of Barbara Hendricks. I started getting messages from across the country. Some were horror stories that made my wind chime fine look tame. Others were success stories from people who'd stood up to their HOAs and won. A few were from HOA board members who wanted to do better but didn't know how. The website became a project I worked on in my spare time. Tom helped with design and organization. Margaret contributed legal resources. Patricia provided attorney referrals. What had started as one man's battle over wind chimes had become something bigger, a resource for people trying to make their HOAs work properly. Life in Sunset Meadows settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new board functioned smoothly, with genuine discussion and debate, but always focused on what was best for the community. We revised the guidelines, cutting out vague or unnecessary rules and making enforcement procedures fair and transparent. We also made it easier for people to participate in HOA governance. We live-streamed board meetings for people who couldn't attend in person. We created a simple online portal for submitting maintenance requests or concerns. We published the budget and financial reports monthly so everyone knew how their dues were being spent. Turnout at board meetings dropped, which was actually a good sign. When the HOA is working properly, most people don't need to show up to meetings. They can trust that things are being handled reasonably. About a year after the election, I was doing yard work when a car pulled up and a man I didn't recognize got out. He was in his 40s, wearing jeans and a polo shirt and had a friendly smile. Jason Vickers, that's me. I'm Dave Martinez. My wife and I are buying a house on Cactus Ridge Court. We close next month. Welcome to the neighborhood. Thanks. I wanted to introduce myself and ask you something. When we were doing our research on the neighborhood, we found all these articles about wind chimes and HOA drama. What's the HOA really like now? Should we be worried? I set down my rake and thought about how to answer. The HOA is what you'd want it to be: functional, reasonable, transparent. We have rules, but they're sensible and enforced fairly. The board is responsive to residents. If you have a problem or concern, you'll be heard. And the wind chime thing, ancient history. Though you'll notice we have a lot of wind chimes around here now. If that bothers you, this might not be the right neighborhood, he laughed. Actually, we love wind chimes. That's part of why we're buying here. A friend sent us the article about your whole battle, and my wife said that's a neighborhood that has its priorities straight. We talked for a few more minutes, and I gave him my number in case he had questions after moving in. As he drove away, I realized that our wind chime rebellion had become part of the neighborhood's identity. When people researched Sunset Meadows, they found those articles. And instead of being put off, many were attracted by what the story represented, a community willing to stand up for common sense. Barbara Hendricks did eventually move. I heard about it through the grapevine about 14 months after the election. She bought a house in a different suburb, one without an HOA. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I never saw or spoke to her again after that phone call following the election. Part of me wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, if she understood how and why things had gone wrong. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all. She was a chapter in our community's history, but not the whole story. 2 years after the original fine notice, I was asked to speak at a national HOA management conference in Las Vegas. They wanted me to share lessons learned from our experience. I almost said no, public speaking wasn't exactly my favorite activity, but Patricia convinced me it was important. People need to hear this, she said. HOA horror stories are everywhere, but success stories are rare. You can help change that. So I went to Las Vegas and stood in front of 300 HOA board members, property managers, and industry professionals. I told them the whole story, from the first absurd fine to the community organizing to the election and aftermath. Here's what I want you to understand, I said in closing. The problem wasn't Chimes. The problem was that one person with a little bit of power decided that her personal preferences were more important than her neighbor's rights. And the system, the HOA structure, enabled that. It gave her tools to harass people, and there were no checks on her authority until we created them. If you're on an HOA board or if you manage HOA properties, please remember that you're serving a community, not ruling one. Listen to people. Be reasonable. Focus on things that actually matter. Don't be Barbara Hendricks. The speech got a standing ovation, which was gratifying but also a little sad. The fact that "don't abuse your authority over chimes" counted as revolutionary advice in the HOA world said a lot about how broken the system often was. After the conference, several people approached me about consulting or speaking at other events. I declined most of them, but I did agree to serve on an advisory committee for revising Arizona's HOA statutes. If we could make the laws clearer and more protective of homeowners' rights, we might prevent future Barbara Hendricks from wreaking havoc. That work continued for the next year, and ultimately resulted in several legislative changes that strengthened due process requirements for HOAs and created clearer standards for what constituted legitimate enforcement actions. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. 3 years after that first fine notice, my term on the HOA board was ending. I'd served my 3 years and accomplished what I'd set out to do. The community was stable, the guidelines were reasonable, and the culture was healthy. It was time for someone else to take over. On my last day as board president, we held our regular monthly meeting. Only about 15 residents attended, which, as I'd noted before, was a good sign. We approved the budget for the coming year, discussed plans for resurfacing the community pool, and debated whether to install additional lighting in the parks. Normal, boring HOA business. Exactly as it should be. Afterward, several neighbors thanked me for my service. Margaret, who'd been re-elected to the board and would be the new president, gave me a small gift, a handmade wind chime crafted by a local artist. "For the man who started a revolution with wind chimes," she said. "May you never stop making beautiful music." I hung it on my porch that evening, right next to the original bamboo chimes. As the sun set and the breeze picked up, both sets chimed together, creating harmonies I hadn't anticipated. Tom came over with beer, as had become our tradition for significant moments. "How does it feel?" he asked. Being a regular citizen again. Good. I missed having my evenings free. Think you'll run again someday? God, I hope not. But if someone like Barbara shows up and nobody else steps up, then yeah, probably. That's the thing about you, Jason. You never wanted to be the guy fighting City Hall or taking on the HOA or organizing the neighborhood. You just wanted wind chimes. Still true. But when it mattered, you did it anyway. That's what makes you exactly the kind of person who should be doing it. We sat in comfortable silence, drinking beer and listening to wind chimes. Up and down the street, dozens of other wind chimes added to the chorus. Some were subtle, some were elaborate, but all were there because we decided together that we had the right to make our homes our own. A few months later, I was featured in a short documentary about HOA reform. The filmmaker had found our story and thought it perfectly illustrated the issues facing many American communities. The film premiered at a small festival in Tempe and later got picked up by a streaming service. I watched it with a group of neighbors at Tom's house. It was strange seeing our experience turned into narrative, complete with dramatic music and interview shots. But the filmmaker had gotten it right. She understood that the story was never really about wind chimes. It was about power, community, and the courage to stand up for what's right even when it seems petty or trivial. The documentary ended with current footage of our neighborhood, wind chimes creating music in the breeze, kids playing in the parks, neighbors talking in driveways. A normal, healthy community. In the end, my voice said over the final images, we didn't win because we fought harder or were smarter or had better lawyers, though Patricia certainly helped. We won because we remembered something important. Communities are made up of people, not rules. Rules should serve people's needs and well-being, not the egos of whoever happens to be in charge. That's true for HOAs, and it's true for any organization or government. The moment we forget that, we get Barbara Hendricks and wind chime fines. The moment we remember it, we get communities where people actually want to live. The film faded to black with the sound of wind chimes continuing. As I write this, 5 years after that first fine notice, life in Sunset Meadows continues peacefully. I'm still living in the same house, still working from home as a software developer, still enjoying the sound of wind chimes on breezy afternoons. The HOA Accountability Toolkit website now gets over 1 million visitors a year. I've connected with people from every state, helping them navigate their own HOA challenges. Some stories end well, some don't, but at least people know they're not alone and they have resources. The Arizona HOA statute reforms are working. Fewer complaints, fewer lawsuits, fewer horror stories. There are still problem HOAs and petty board members, but the laws now provide better protection and clearer remedies. Tom and I still have coffee on Saturday mornings. His daughter graduated high school and is studying environmental science at Arizona State. Margaret continues to lead the HOA board with patience and common sense. Patricia has become the go-to attorney for HOA disputes in the Phoenix area, with a reputation for taking on bullies and winning. Christine Ferris still lives next door. We're friendly, occasionally borrowing tools or accepting package deliveries for each other. She has her own set of wind chimes now, small silver ones that make a delicate tinkling sound. I never heard what happened to Barbara Hendricks. I hope she found peace somewhere, though I suspect people like her don't change easily. Maybe she learned something from being voted out so decisively. Maybe she didn't. Either way, she's not my problem anymore. The original bamboo wind chimes still hang on my front porch. The finish has weathered a bit over 5 years of Arizona sun, and the sound has mellowed slightly, but they still work perfectly. Every time I hear them, I'm reminded of that absurd fine notice and everything that followed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just paid the $500 and taken them down. I'd have saved myself months of stress, conflict, and work. My life would have been simpler, but the neighborhood would be worse off. Barbara would have continued her petty tyranny. Other residents would have continued feeling powerless against an arbitrary board. The community would have been diminished in ways both obvious and subtle. So no, I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret the lawsuit, the organizing, the election, or any of it. I'm proud of what we accomplished, even if it started with something as simple and small as wind chimes. Because that's the thing about standing up to bullies and abuse of power. It's never really about the specific issue. It's about the principle. It's about refusing to accept that might makes right, that authority can't be questioned, that ordinary people should just shut up and do what they're told. Wind chimes were my line in the sand. For someone else, it might be fence colors or garden gnomes or Christmas decorations. The specific issue doesn't matter. What matters is recognizing when authority has overstepped its bounds and being willing to push back. And if you do push back, you might be surprised how many of your neighbors are ready to stand with you. Most people are reasonable. Most people want to live in communities that are fair and sensible. Most people are tired of petty tyrants and arbitrary rules. They just need someone to go first. Someone to hang wind chimes and refuse to take them down. Someone to say, "No, this is unreasonable and I won't accept it." That someone was me, somewhat accidentally, but I'm glad it was. My house still feels like home. My neighborhood is genuinely a community, and on quiet evenings, the sound of wind chimes reminds me that small acts of resistance matter. The wind picks up, and all along Desert Rose Drive, dozens of wind chimes sing together. It's the sound of a community that found its voice, and it's beautiful.